our webinar on strategic stockpiles, it's fair to say that the global economy or global trade hasn't run as smoothly in recent years as we were used to in the period before, to the point that a number of countries are asking themselves quite seriously whether they need strategic stockpiles of some critical raw materials, goods, in order to ensure the resilience of their supply chains. Now, this is rather new in the industrial sector, but it's a well-known phenomenon in agriculture and a bit in the energy sector as well. So we thought, why don't we look at agriculture to learn? And I'm very happy that I have to begin with our Director of Trade and Agriculture, very fittingly, who will introduce us into the subject, which we are presenting, or we have organized this event together with Bettina Rudloff of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And well, after presentation by the FAO on agricultural stockpiles, I will have a very varied panel of experts who will be able to discuss this subject with us. I'll present them later. And now over to you, Marion. We're curious what you have to say about this from the OECD perspective.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for this introduction, and thanks to the Berlin office for organizing this webinar on a very, very timely issue. And I can already give away my main message. Above all, yes, learn from agriculture as much as possible. If in any government there are discussions or considerations to look into stockpiling for other sectors. Why? Because ensuring food security for national domestic populations is probably one of the eldest accepted public government objectives. And there is a long tradition in many countries in looking into how to ensure security of access to food. And stockpiling is one of the tools that has often been used in this regard. At the OECD, we have tried to learn as much as possible and as rapidly as possible from agriculture when, after the two shocks that followed in short sequence, the COVID-19 shock and the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it became very clear that the question of how to ensure resilience in supply chains and access to critical inputs into supply chain or to critical materials, goods, inputs, how to ensure this when we realize that this will become a key element of our work that our members, our policymakers would be asking us for. Let me start with some anecdotes on why this was clearly something that was important for our policy agenda. Well, first, I'm German, but I lived in Switzerland when COVID-19 hit us. And I think it's fair to say that both these countries, Germany and Switzerland, consider that they have an important role to play when it comes to the medical sector or pharmaceuticals in particular. This is something that the countries produce. They are active in the pharmaceutical sector, and the health system is something that the population in Switzerland and Germany expects to function. Now, in countries like this, to go through a period where suddenly there is no access to masks, suddenly there's no access or limited access to basic medicaments, where suddenly there is a lack of access to disinfectants, that was a shock for the population. So clearly something that policymakers had to look into. And it may not be surprising, I will come back to this, that at the OECD we are working closely with Switzerland when it comes to addressing supply chain resilience in the pharmaceutical sector. I have another anecdote on food. I mentioned to you the second crisis, a Russian aggression against Ukraine made at least two items, access to two items, very visible, access to energy for definitely for part of European countries, and access to food, given the importance of Russia and the Ukraine as food producers. Now, in that period, an American news channel wanted to interview me because there was a consideration that there would be a potentially significant lack of access to French fries in France because of the lack of access to sunflower oil, and that this would probably be a major food security issue for France. I had to reassure friends from the media that first, as a European, I consider French fries to be Belgian fries, and second, that lack of access to French fries would not represent a food security issue in France. Nevertheless, food security was high on the agenda at the time and something we were looking into. Now, what did we do at the OECD? We brought together experts from across our memberships who in relevant ministries were looking into access to critical inputs in supply chains. What are we doing to understand how supply chain functions, how to identify possible bottlenecks in supply chains, and how to address those. And invited to those meetings were chief economists from agricultural ministries. And the first thing all the other ministries realized is that the agricultural ministries knew this topic, had systems in place for this topic, and had in several countries amazing access to information on stocks in their country, harvests first, stocks second, and even to logistics. And that information, that transparency, those are exercises that are not only working at the national level, but that are being deployed at the international level. One of the very successful initiatives called for by the G20 in the aftermath of the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and remember that crisis at some stage was called the triple F crisis, full food and financial crisis. Food played a role. One of the mechanisms that was called for was for the establishment of an agricultural market information system called AMIS. That's a transparency tool that contains information on major commodities being traded in international markets. That information system is being run under the lead of FAO, but agencies like the OECD contribute to this. And you will find if you Google AMIS in agricultural market information system, you will find that one of the pieces of information contained in a database is information on stocks. Why was it considered useful to have information on stocks in that tool? The whole information system, the transparency system, was set up to avoid panic reactions in markets. If at the global level, populations and policymakers know what does the harvest look like where for a given commodity, what are the stocks, how high or how low are they, and where are those stocks, that can, in most cases, play a very useful role in calming markets. This has been proven during the COVID-19 crisis. It did not immediately function in the aftermath of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but kicked in at some stage. This transparency tool working at the international level has been very useful, and our members definitely are considering to build these type of tools for other goods or other products. Agriculture is not the only community that has information internationally about stocks. There's another community, the financial community. Minimum capital requirements were something that was introduced in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. Transparency mechanisms were introduced that would allow regulators to know which bank holds how much capital where. And again, this was meant to be useful in times of crisis. Learning from those who created this information system at national or international levels in the financial sector, learning from those can also be useful for communities working on industrial products. But let me come back to agriculture before I then go to more general lessons on stockpiling. The agricultural community does not only have information tools, transparency tools at the national level in many countries, at the international level, I mentioned AMIS, it also has international communities of practice. What is this? These are groups of experts from different government agencies, from different capitals, always from the agricultural ministry, sorry, that come together, are in exchange, and analyze what is happening in markets. We notably, together with the FAO and in collaboration with teams from capitals, produce at the OECD each year what we call an agricultural outlook that provides information on how we expect agricultural markets to evolve. Again, this is a very powerful forward-looking transparency tool. So a lot to learn from the agricultural community. We also at the OECD have conducted already a number of years ago analysis on how stockpiling can work. What should stockpiling ideally have to be designed like if governments decide to use it as a tool to manage resilience. Here are just a few hints that I expect the following speakers will say more about. We have found that it is important if governments want to intervene in stockpiling, that they should consider not only what those stockpiles do in terms of crisis, but also how they affect markets, domestic markets and international markets in the short, medium, and long run. Stockpiles may affect incentives, notably by the private sector, on how to behave, and they may affect prices. If the government decides to get active in this space, it also has to assess what is the private sector already doing and what is the right space for the public sector when compared to the private sector. We do consider that collaboration, coordination, some kind of exchange with the private sector is important in this context. And important for the government, if the government wants to intervene, it has to think of the fiscal costs of stockpiles and have to take into account that whenever the stockpiles create inefficiencies or do not work in the way they should work, for instance, because the stocks are not valid anymore, cannot be used anymore at the time the crisis hits, then there's a high fiscal cost to a low result in terms of resilience. So the question, the problem governments are facing is not a straightforward one, and it probably differs across sector and across product. Notably, the possibility to maintain stocks differs a lot across the type of goods that you are looking into. That's why at the OECD, we are looking at this question very much at the supply chain level. We have separate work going on the agri-food supply chains. We are, as I already mentioned, discussing and exchanging with public and private sector on the possibilities for government policies to facilitate resilience in the pharmaceutical sector. And we are continuing these discussions on raw materials, on semiconductors, and do not exclude to move into other supply chains in the future. And that's why, even after having spoken to you all, I will continue to listen in order to learn from the interventions of this panel. I thank you and wish you a good discussion.
Thank you very much, Marion, for giving us this overview and explaining a bit more why it is so important to learn from agriculture when you think about strategic stockpiling in other areas. And this is why I'm particularly happy that I can welcome Georgios Mermikas and Cosimo Avesani from the FAO, who have a very nice and good and extensive report on the experience with stockpiles in agriculture. And this is what we will build on when we later discuss the issue more generally. So Georgios and Cosimo, we are very curious what you will tell us about what we can learn from agriculture in this field.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will start. My name is, first of all, George Mermigas. I'm a senior economist in the Markets and Trade Division of FAO. In this division, I would like to build a little bit on what Marion just said. In this division, we do provide market transparency, market intelligence to our members. We are very happy with the collaboration with the OECD and other organizations in the area of FAMIS, Agricultural Market Information System. We are really happy to host this and to facilitate its operations. And also, as Marion said, we're really happy for the collaboration with the OECD in the area of the medium-term outlook, the agricultural outlook, which has already reached more than a quarter of the century, more than 25 years, providing medium-term projections and analysis for the main markets. As part of this work that we do in the FAO on markets and trade, we also provide evidence about several important areas, important topics in the field of trade. And some of the participants in this webinar today, I'm very happy to see some old friends participating. They have even worked with FAO in the past, providing this evidence, building analysis and providing evidence on several trade-related topics. In this context, for instance, we have a publication. We have a report that we will not present today, but we have a report on what were the policy responses during the first wave of COVID, and where we examined what the countries did, including on whether they took measures to stockpile, to pile stocks and to increase their stocks during this period. But also in this context, we have produced this publication that you can see there on public food stock holding policies and practices. On my side, I coordinated this publication, but my colleague Cosimo, who was one of the authors of the publication, will present it. What I want only to say is that this report, which was published a few years ago, the purpose is to showcase the diversity of the instruments used and to investigate the scope of such programs. Basically, it builds on what Marion said before, how these contracts, what type of programs are being implemented in terms of stocks, how they're being implemented, how they are actualized, and how they linked to other different various policy instruments. What implications do they have? Because these programs, they have implications both at domestic and international markets. They have implications both within the country that is applying the measures, but also on their trading partners. And of course, we have some examples of how with specific countries mentioned, of how these programs have been implemented. We are very well aware that this is a very controversial and very hot topic in the WTO negotiations. On our side, we're not going to get into what the discussions in the WTO are. This goes beyond our mandate in this presentation, at least. But we are very happy that we have this report. We're very happy to provide the experience that we have acquired preparing this report on how these programs are being implemented in the agricultural sector and what the implications are. And of course, we are happy, Cosimo and I, he will say that himself, I'm sure, we will be happy to give answers at the end of these presentations and to facilitate, to the extent possible, your efforts to see whether such programs can be implemented in other sectors as well. And with these few words on my side, I will hand it over to Cosimo to continue with the presentation. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George. So I will start my presentation by asking a question. Why public food stock hold? Well, we said it before, the reason is rather simple, as food stocks, both private and public, historically received a lot of attention at times of food crisis. And if we look back, we see that the relationship between the level of global stocks, price volatility, food security has been many, many times at the center of the debate. It was the case in 1974. It was the case during the 2007-2008 food price crisis, and of course, in the aftermath and during COVID-19. And as a matter of fact, after the 2007-2008 food price crisis, countries renewed their interest in the use of public stockholding. And it is not the case that the volume of global cereal stocks for all main crops have gradually increased since then. Public stockholding, as we discussed in this specific paper, refers to the procurement, storage, and release of food stocks by governments through state-owned enterprises or other public agencies. Clearly, public stocks can comprise of both domestically procured and imported food. And one of the reasons behind the choice of establishing a public stockholding program is that in the event of a production shortfall or in case of market disruptions, a large number of people can fall in distress with the creation, as we were mentioning before, of a national emergency. And in fact, as we observed in the write-up of the study, countries that have a history of famine, or let's say that are frequently exposed to shocks, droughts, floods, conflicts, are generally more prone to maintain stocks, and in particular of grain. Now, in our study, we identified that countries tend to maintain one to three types of food stocks. These are emergency stocks, buffer stocks, and stocks for domestic food distribution, which kind of differ in their objectives. Okay, emergency stocks are used in the case of emergency, so they aim to reduce the vulnerability of consumers in specific cases. Buffer stocks are normally used to stabilize prices, and stock for domestic food distribution normally have the objective to promote physical and economic access to quantities of food for specific target populations. School feeding programs, for instance, they would end up under the food stocks for the stocks for food distribution. However, when it comes to practice, making a distinction between the different types of stocks can be rather unclear. Okay, so we have countries attempting to achieve several objectives at the same time. But let's look at the key functions. So basically how generally public stockholding programs work. So as mentioned before, there are three basic elements of a public stockholding program, which are the procurement, the storage, and the release of stocks. Now, depending on the program's objectives, these functions are carried out or reinforced through a combination of policy measures, each of which can, of course, have implication for producers and consumers, both within and outside the country implementing the measure. But let us take this simplest example, the price support linked to the procurement of public stocks. So it is clear then when a country procures at admin price, they can, of course, try to achieve the policy objective to support the farmers. And this has obviously some positive effects because by providing a guaranteed market outlet and predictable prices, the public procurement can support the farm incomes. On the other side, admin prices may also provide incentive for the farmers to basically overproduce, which might be killing competitiveness. So we have a positive effect and a negative effect. And what is this telling us? It tells us that even the most simple, basic policy option may have some trade-offs. But let's look as well to another example, which is linked to the release of the stocks. So we know that public stockholding programs are often directly linked to social safety net measures. Countries often implement measures to ensure that certain quantities of food grains can reach the vulnerable populations at a subsidized price. And this, of course, is positive because what you do is basically you lower the price of food for layers of the population that are in need. However, when the measure is not properly targeted, not properly designed, the overall benefit received by the consumers as a whole can be downsized. For instance, if there are other very poor consumers in the country, which, however, are not reached by such measures, the combination of high admin prices and, let's say, import barriers, no, because you also want to protect your production, what is going to happen is going to happen that you're going to have higher food prices, and this is going to have negative effects on the access to food for the global consumers. Again, what is the point here? That once again, uh, when we look at the measures that accompany, reinforce the public stockholding programs, depending on their implementations, the implication for producers and consumers within and outside the country that implements the measures may change. Uh, but let's look as well at some possible impacts on the market. This slide is not changing. So public stockholding programs can have, as we said, an impact for both domestic and international markets. And this slide, we present the domestic consideration first, and then we will go to the ones of the international market. So we're going to focus in here on the pros and cons for producers, consumers, and as well for the government budgets. So for producers, of course, as we said, public procurement, for instance, a guaranteed price, even if it is below international price, it can provide a stable market and less variable income. And this, of course, it's particularly important in difficult settings or as well in underdeveloped markets. However, the procurement can also create an over-reliance, no, on the institutional markets, implying that the private sector is kind of crowded out in the downstream processing and the trading activities, which might be limiting the market development. For the consumers, we have seen that the distribution of food stocks, for instance, during emergencies, but also as a part of regular food distribution programs, it can be an important form of social protection. But as well, in the longer run, production may be also skewed towards commodities that are procured by the government, which are typically non-perishable products like cereals. And this might go at the expenses of products with higher nutritional values. So we might create a nutritional problem. And for governments, of course, stock procurements and release are, I would say, a rather practical way to support the domestic consumers and as well the producers. But operating public stocks may come with extremely high fiscal costs, as we said before. There was a beautiful study from the World Bank, 2012. They were looking at the stocks in India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Zambia. And they were assessing that let's say the cost of operating public stockholding programs was estimated to vary between, talking of average, between 0.5 and 1.5% of the GDP. Okay. And this, of course, may include different cost of procurements, storage, release, distribution of stocks. But of course, you have also to factor in possible inefficiencies in the implementation of the program, which can, of course, compound the overall costs. So in short, in consideration of these effects, but generally speaking, in the trade policy sector, the choice of a policy instrument should, let's say, always be informed by context-specific analysis against the alternatives. And this should be done in terms of impact, the cost efficiency, and of course, the viability for achieving the same objectives. And beyond the domestic consideration, public stockholding programs can also affect traded volumes and prices, depending, of course, on the scale of the operations and the size, the status of the market of the country that implements them. This ultimately has impacts on producers and consumers in other countries. So for producers, the effects are, I would say, mainly negative. For instance, the import demand is usually reduced in the countries that are holding large stocks, which is reducing market opportunities for the producers in other countries. And worse, if stock release decisions are unpredictable, let's say, or that they are not factoring into traders' decision making, this can also influence very much the price levels. And for consumers, of course, ample stocks can provide confidence in the availability of supplies to deal, especially with exogenous shocks, as was mentioned before. But the concentration of supplies in very few countries, which is kind of the case when we're talking about agriculture, this can imply uncertainty about the availability of those stocks on the world markets in the event, as we said before, of global shocks. So considering the potential impact of public stock holding programs on global market, the subject has been subject to a significant debate in different forums. But let's now just give a very quick overview of some programs. So as it was mentioned at the beginning, the study on which this presentation is based provides a survey of public stock holding programs in 19 countries plus the European Union. And here we have 5 country examples showing the diversity of the programs in relation to their objectives, the type of stocks, and the procurement-related policy measures. And I don't want to lose too much time on this slide, but in a nutshell, what we can observe is that there are some countries that, for instance, tend to use both domestic production and imports to replenish the stocks. That others use reserves with objectives to stabilize the prices. Others have in mind the support for family farmers. Others focus on different things like food emergency and price stabilization. And if we look at the release side of the stocks, we see as well different options and as well how things change over time. So in some countries like the EU in the past, a key outlet for stocks were the exports, for which export subsidies were used. In other countries today, the main outlets for the stocks release as domestic, and the stocks can be released, as we said before, through free food distribution during the emergencies, through distribution programs, school feeding, we mentioned it before, or direct subsidies as well, the so-called bread subsidies. So overall, these few cases shows us that with public stock holding programs, first countries often aim to fulfill both producers and consumers-oriented objectives at the same time, that their implementation involves a number of policy measures, procurement admin price, consumer support measures, export subsidies, and that both the objective and the policy measures used to implement them have changed and continue to evolve over time. And while this seems to be kind of a simple point, it is important to recognize that there is considerable diversity in the way in which these programs are implemented, and these are not directly comparable to each other. But let's wrap up now. Let's conclude. So as discussed, public stock holding programs, once again, can aim to achieve different objectives. However, let's say the line between these objectives can be quite thin. So countries may use the same stocks to provide incentives for producers, address chronic food insecurity, or ensure availability of food during the emergencies. And precisely for this reason, in the drafting of the study, we realized that public stock holding programs worldwide are extremely hard to compare across countries. Difference applies to the way countries procure, manage, release their stocks. And of course, public stock holding programs can play a very important role both at the domestic and international level. For instance, as mentioned, ample supplies of food can have a stabilizing effect on the commodity markets. Public food procurement, when properly targeted, can also provide the farmers with predictable prices, higher income. Plus, subsidized food can ensure physical and economic access to the poorest consumers, despite, let's say, volatility in price. But we also discussed some negative implication, let's say, which is in addition to the high fiscal costs. So public stock holding programs should always be carefully evaluated against other policy alternatives, depending on each individual context. And with this, I think I've concluded my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed as much as I enjoyed it joining you today. And I'll stay with you and answer to any related questions you may have. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Cosimo and Georgios. And the chat is already heating up. And in order to be able to respond to it, I will ask my wonderful panel on the screen. So we have experts from three countries, first of all, who are in different stages, let's say, of developing the idea of stockpiles in various areas or having a long tradition of implementing it. The long tradition is Switzerland. Perhaps some people may be surprised by that. And we're lucky to have Stefan Menzi of the Federal Office for National Economic Supply, who does run the stock programs there. Welcome. And then we have from Spain, which is in the process of implementing a sort of strategic reserve program for the industrial sector, Fernando Boreda-Juste. Very welcome on the screen. It's good to have you here. And from the Netherlands, Dan Freeman, who's from the Bureau for Economic Analysis, so a researcher and policy advisor. The Netherlands, like Germany, from which we also have a representative, is more in the process of thinking about whether they might want to have these stockpiles, something that's certainly heavily discussed at the EU level. So from Germany, we have Anne Lauenroth. She represents the Association of German Industries. So that's also very good to have an industry representative. And last but not least, of course, we have Bettina Rudloff, who already from the German Institute for International Security Affairs, and she's the spiritual rector or the spirita rector a little bit of this this debate. Yeah, and in the chat I noticed, so Cosimo is very cautious, talking about the pros and the cons, but in the chat you could already see that stockpiles steer emotions, and we had words like the disastrous experience of the cup and and some examples of where stockpile policies didn't work as they were supposed to be working. So Bettina, maybe you can give us, without going in too many details, but perhaps what's the current debate, perhaps in agriculture? So why are countries debating about it? What are the main things that are being debated? What do we have to be careful about when we think about these stockpiles in the industrial sector?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy to join again as Spirita Sancta, together with the other Spirita Sancta, Nicola. So it sounds very Sancta altogether. No, the idea for my contribution was a bit to give the setting maybe more to the non-agriculture expert than to those very much already into the issue. On the question of what are underlying rules which exist internationally for stocks, and then to give a short example, and Cosimo already touched upon that, how that actually was or has that developed in the EU and as well in Germany. So starting with the international rules. As Cosimo hinted at, stocks, so both the procurement and the release, has effects. It has effects on markets, both domestically and as well internationally, or it can have effects, let's say. And because that's the case, the multilateral institution, which we in these days forget about, the WTO, has defined actually some rules on that. And there is an agriculture agreement that has been concluded in the mid of the 90s, looking at different agricultural trade-related measures to limit what Cosimo generally stressed upon market effects. And immediately one thinks about tariffs, but this agreement as well looked at subsidies. and subsidies applied in the directly or explicitly domestically, but as well so-called export subsidies. And all these instruments, for all these, you find rules in this agreement on agriculture. And the stock issue is related to the subsidies ruling. So being a domestically applied subsidies and export subsidies. Starting with export subsidies, there were defined limitations for WTO members, but since the Nairobi Ministerial Conference in 2015, they had been abolished completely. Side remark, for industrial policy, they are anyhow forbidden, these export subsidies, but for agriculture since then. Looking at the domestic or rules on domestic subsidies, we had already an event to learn from agriculture on the subsidies part, the last. And one can remind on that there's a so-called traffic light system in the agreement on agriculture and the WTO, meaning something is red and forbidden, something is amber and had to be reduced, and something is green and can be used. And the general logic behind is, I'm simplifying now really very much, green is allowed if it's market neutral. And that is as well linked to stocks or the procuring of stocks. So if this procurement is market neutral, it will be addressed as a green box measure under the agreement, and that will be fine. Otherwise, it has to be follow the amber box logic, meaning to be reduced. And that already maybe gives the idea that a lot of conflicts around this issue arose, meaning whether countries really fit their stock procurement within the green box, whether they may be lower or how to say, risk their amber box limitation or not. And a lot of conflicts was around that. Since 2013, the Bali Ministerial Conference, and later the Nairobi again in 2015, a so-called interim or peace clause commitment was concluded, meaning that now actually the previous rules are not to be, or it's much open. You can, if there are certain criteria, meaning there's an official public program addressed to stocks, you can use them, and you can use them enormously. And you may have heard that India is the country actually with the most enormous public stocks. So that are the rules. There are rules. However, since this peace clause, they are now complete or very much loosened. And the whole issue, as you can see, is politicized and conflict related. For the EU, just 2 words. Historically, the bulk was on buffer stock according to the COSIMO's classification. Still, there exists a possibility for some certain agricultural products, which is mainly grain products and some animal products. So as a safety net in case of market risks. And as well, there is public aid for private storage, which can be then paid to private actors. They are a bit different. The products, not all the same, like for the public stock safety net idea. For instance, olive oil is as well addressed. And what we can see recently, which I just want to stress, is there's a shift in understanding of emergency. In the EU, it's more on the idea of supporting the functioning of the internal market, which is based on the COVID experience. You remember all the lockdowns and barriers. And there's now a new contingency plan in the EU, and the so-called, this abbreviation is so complicated, the EFSM, European Food Security Crisis Preparedness and Response Mechanism. And that's basically a coordination mechanism and an information mechanism. And the last new shift, what we can see is in the EU, there's an idea of the security lens for policy is as well touching agriculture. So we have a reform of what is called critical entities. And that means to oblige private actors for certain supply security. And food is number 11 in the respective European directive on that, but not the primary agriculture production, but food processing and retail. And that has now to be implemented at the member state level. And in Germany, not a lot of people know that we have as well public stocks since what we called the Cold War. So we have two emergency reserves, basically. One is called, in English, it's just my own translation, a grain emergency reserve and a civil reserve. Around 1 million ton of products altogether for 21 million euro per year. And since years, there was a lot of criticism by the Court of Auditors because the system is, as Cosimo as well already mentioned, very, very expensive. However, it's in place in Germany still. It's decentralized, allocated all over the country. It has never been used yet, but it's in place. And I stop here just to give you a very broad idea on the European shift. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bettina. And I think I can foresee trouble already. Well, Stefan has experience with it, but Fernando and other European countries who may follow the call by the Draghi report to have some national strategic stockpiles of critical raw materials and then perhaps manage it at the EU level, they can prepare themselves for conflict, it seems. But yeah, coming to Switzerland, perhaps the host the WTO, and I always think of Switzerland as a very market friendly country, very little bureaucracy and open markets, etc. So when I heard, oh, there has been a system of stockpiles for a long time, I was almost a little bit surprised. Now, I think it does comply a lot with these rules that Marion mentioned earlier. So there's an intricate data management system. You're doing it together with the private sector, I understand. But perhaps you can tell us more about it. How does it work in Switzerland? How did it come about? And do you face these international conflicts about prices to build the reserves or release of the reserves?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola, and hello again to everybody. Yeah, Switzerland has a long a system for stockpiling for a long time, but Switzerland does not hold, or the Swiss state does not hold stockpiles by themselves. But Switzerland requires companies that operate in sectors affected by strategic stockpiling to such as grain mills or oil companies to hold additional stocks to those required for operational reasons. In principle, these stocks are financed by the companies themselves. However, since the state does not want to impose an obligation on small and very small companies for administrative reasons, individual economic sectors can operate guarantee funds on a private level that are fed by levies, either on imports or the first placing on the market. And then these guarantee funds compensate the companies that actually hold the physical stocks for their storage. This eliminates market distortions in Switzerland because the individual economic sectors bear the costs themselves. With this system, they have an interest in organizing their warehousing effectively and efficiently. In the area of agricultural goods, the cost of storage are reimbursed by the guarantee funds when the goods are exported in processed products, so that the storage does not disadvantage the export industry in relation to foreign competition. If, for example, a baked goods like a sweet contains 40% sugar, 40% flours, 20% seed oil, the guarantee funds concerned repay the contribution levied on sale or import on a pro rata basis to the exporter to avoid market distortions. there's a little problem on agricultural products because within with agreements with the World Trade Organization or other free trade partners, the import taxes are limited. So if the guarantee fund imposes levies on the import, that means that the Swiss state reduces that import taxes on the same level. If the import taxes are 100 Swiss francs for something and the guarantee fund needs 20 francs, then the taxes the Swiss state will take will be reduced to 80 Swiss francs, so that there's no problem with international agreements. That's more or less a little bit the system how Switzerland is organizing the strategic stockpiling.
Well, maybe you can just, it sounds as if you have solved all the problems that were brought up by Cosimo and Georgios. But I'm just curious, how come that Switzerland has this system of stockpiles? Is it a wartime relic, or when was it created?
Yeah, it's kind of a wartime relic, that's true. We did not have after the First World War, we saw it's a real problem. And for the Second World War, Switzerland was preparing a more efficient system of stockpiling. And since then, we always kept part of the system that was created at that time. But sometimes, yeah, we have, for example, for agricultural products, we have grain, we have cooking oil, there is coffee, there is rice, but we see nowadays that's okay. Those are buffer stocks that can keep the prices a little bit under pressure if there's less panic, if there's a shortage on the market. However, we see with changed food habits, we eat much more convenience food. We have much different distribution channels today. We eat much more outside in the restaurant and less at home. We are not sure if the products we keep nowadays are still the right products we would need in case of an emergency.
Okay. And well, I'll come back to you about pharmaceuticals and other industrial products, but I think let me move first to, well, the country that is sort of next in line, Spain, because you have started perhaps following the EU discussions or the COVID crisis, I don't know, but you have started seriously thinking about a system of strategic reserves, but for the industrial sector. And yeah, we would be curious to hear, well, the rationale. Why did you decide to actually develop it, and where you stand? What do you want to use it for? And how is it going so far?
Thank you very much, Nicola and OECD and the German Institute for Security Affairs for giving us this opportunity to explain which is that system. In Spain, as Mrs. Jansen has mentioned, the debate on the strategic reserves has been and is strongly shaped by all the recent supply chain crisis, a COVID pandemic, and especially increasing geopolitical tensions. Those has exposed the fragility of the industrial global value chain, and especially the risk of over-reliance and strategic dependence on third country. So in Spain, we have three core priorities that guide our policy that also has been afterwards highlighted by Draghi and Niinistö reports that are first, industrial resilience, second, crisis preparedness, which include legal, operational, and governance, and third, reduction of strategic dependencies. With this context, our approach in Recapit focus in two main objectives. The first one is ensuring the continuity of the supply of critical resources during crisis. But in second place, and very closely related, is creating industrial intelligence, which supports medium and long-term planning policy in strategic sectors. But this is important. It's not about autarky. It's about supporting national and European industry as a key pillars for both economic growth and security. In this sense, it's not about food security itself, like, for example, a stock of grain that Stefan had mentioned or Jansen had mentioned. It's about ensuring the access to the industrial inputs, such as fertilizers, that are essential to guarantee fat production. So it's not about storing grains, storing any other food, but having the capacity to produce fertilizers that are essential to the food productions. And this is where industrial preparedness and resilience it becomes critical. And this is why RECAPI, that is stands for Reserva Estratégica Basada en Producción Industrial, or strategic reserve based on industrial production capabilities, offer an alternative to physical stockpiling, but focusing on mobilizing actual or assured manufacturing capabilities that can be activated in the case of crisis. And as we said, regarding what are our current plans and implementation, I can extend more of us, but I would like first to clarify what it is. And it is a system, it's a model of strategic reserves that activates pre-contracted national or European production capabilities in response to supply disruption, and is built around three main components. The main one is mapping, monitoring, and in case of crisis, activating industrial capabilities. The second is having a legal, operational, and governmental framework for, as Mrs. Jansen also mentioned it, public-private cooperation, including pre-contracted companies or production lines of specific strategic resources. And it's not only about contractual agreements, it's also about public-private trust. So we are developing a standardized certification system to identify and collaborate with these trusted companies that are committed to national or European open strategic autonomy, which is kind of similar to the sovereignty seal, which is proposed under the EU STEP regulations, and serve us to recognize such companies as critical for the national security or economic resilience or open strategic approval. The current status is that although RECAPI is still waiting for parliamentary approval under the draft law on industry and strategic autonomy, most of its tools and framework has been already developed in 2023 with the support of the European Commission through the technical support instrument, and even some components are already being applied on a pilot basis in coordination with national crisis response structures. Important is the next phase, which will be focusing on strengthening RECAPI European dimension and will be implemented with a new TSI support between end of this year 25 and the next 2026 in collaboration with Finland, Portugal, and Romania. So basically, as a summary, implementation, it goes in two phases. First one is national readiness based on interim use of existing tools and legal frameworks, and will be a full deployment once the new industry and strategic autonomy law is approved. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm really available to respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we'll be back with questions. I have one actually, because it did sound, you said it's more about, perhaps you stressed a little bit the instrument of monitoring and really having the market data as a first line of defense, let's say it, and rather than the physical stockpiling. Is that what you're aiming at? So yes, the data collection?
Yes, absolutely. That's what you understood. We are not focused on stockpiling because our experience from the COVID was that stockpiling is a very limited solution. Of course, for certain medicines or certain products, there is no other choice than stockpiling. But in general, what we want is more recovering production capabilities in local or European soil that will be activated in the case of crisis and are either prearranged or are part of these certifications or this group of industry interested in strategic autonomy with whom we will have a more integration relationship.
Brilliant. So, Anne Lauenroth from the Association of German Industry. So, Germany is not yet in the group of countries that is sort of, well, starting to implement or think seriously about whether or not some strategic reserves are needed for resilient industrial supply chains. But obviously, it will be interesting to hear from you. Well, where do you see the discussion, and what are how does German industry look at this problem? Do you see stockpiles as one potential instrument to ensure supply chain resilience in an uncertain world, or do you see other instruments like I don't know, well, data on monitoring for sure, just knowing what's happening, but also perhaps more local, regional production? How do you look at this?
Yes, hello. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation. I hope you can hear me well. Perfect. It's very interesting to follow because indeed I work very much on the questions of critical raw materials. And so it's relevant and interesting to hear kind of about the experiences that are there also from other sectors. And you mentioned also the medicine area. And so we have also discussions there with colleagues here, but especially on the question of critical raw materials. So far in Germany, we do not have a strategic reserve or some form of stockpiling with regard to certain critical metals. But we started very much the discussion around it because of the question of kind of upcoming potential supply risk with regard to critical minerals, especially also in the EU context with the Critical Raw Materials Act. The question of the means or an instrument of at least sharing information on what is there as stockpiling in the European member states and what could be measures to strengthen such an instrument came up. So far, what our companies are doing, they are having their own stockpiling if they have it. So they kind of, with regard to price peaks, with regard to risks that are there due to their supply chain, companies have their own company stockpiles. And so far, also we as a business association rather promoted the idea how this form of own company managed stockpiling can be, let's say, supported, can be incentivized a bit, I think, according to what I heard also from Switzerland. So that is interesting for me to hear the ideas there. So far, we don't have it. So it's so far a cost burden for companies to do that. So they all evaluate very much whether they should have stockpiles or not. So there is no, let's say, requirement or there's no clear system, but it's on a very individual basis. We also argued very much that it makes sense that the companies are doing it themselves because they have the best knowledge kind of about their own demand. And also, if I look at the German industry as a whole, in there, we have a lot of SMEs also. We have a lot of very diverse demand and requirements, also specifications that companies need with regard to raw materials or refined raw materials or even more processed raw materials. And so there, if the discussion goes, and we have discussions about that, there are so far more questions, I would say, than answers. So maybe kind of discussing in which regard kind of for a very limited or certain group of metals, critical minerals, or refined processed products, there might be out of resilience and national security evaluations, there might be an argument kind of for some form of also more strategic stockpile. But as said, it's very much a question at the moment or under discussion how this would look like. And so we see a bit of discussions also with regard to the security and defense sector. as one of the sectors where also European production is supposed to be accelerated and also extended. And so in that sense, it's also looking there on the materials and product components that are needed in order to be more resilient, which I think is an important discussion. And so this is I think very much as I see it in the Draghi report. Indeed, it was mentioned that there should be one step forward, but as I see it, kind of in the European context, it's at the moment very much about sharing information on the different discussions in the EU member states, and then bringing it up to a let's say very well-founded discussion on potential concepts, on potential requirements, what instruments kind of for which reason to have forms of stockpiling. But I would avoid, or I would not from an industry point of view, and that is why I think the Swiss example is interesting. We see a lot of also potential, let's say, negative consequences when, let's say, there is a bottom-up, a top-down, a stockpiling mechanism or whatever kind of decided upon. So it needs a lot of discussions, I think, kind of which purpose such instruments, which forms they should have, and also debating very much the chances and risks for also a very diverse, I would say, form of actors. If I look even in Germany, but then at a European level, kind of for which purpose such an instrument would make sense. Maybe as some remarks how this is viewed from our industry side. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. And well, we have a lot of interesting questions and comments from the audience, and I'm not forgetting those. But as questions pile up in my mind, including to Stefan Menzi and others, also to the FAO, I do want to ask Dan Freeman first, how the discussion is viewed in the Netherlands. If you're if you're going to stockpile anytime soon, collect data, or just observe what the others are doing with interest.
Yes, thank you, Nicola, and also thanks a lot to Cosimo for the very interesting presentation. So I'll try to keep it a bit brief, so we can also deal with some of the questions that are arising in the chat and in your head. So the situation in the Netherlands is as for the food stockpiles, basically we have none. The thinking here is very much we are producing more or less enough food for ourselves. Of course, we're exporting a lot right now, but in a situation where it would be necessary, there should be more or less enough food for the country. And of course, we are happy to also rely on trade to import food. As such, there is no real a public stockpile for food. And I don't think this is also a current discussion with respect to food. Much more what is on the mind of the policymakers now is the discussion around the critical raw materials and the supply chain resilience or strategic autonomy of the Netherlands. And here the discussion it's still very much starting up. I feel there is still a lot of different viewpoints being debated. One thing I think that is key for the Netherlands, since we are a relatively small and open economy, is that there is a sense that recognizes these raw materials are very important. And a lot of the Netherlands it produces very few critical raw materials. Let's say we import a lot, but they are often just sent to other European countries. And the industry in the Netherlands itself uses relatively little raw materials. So the thinking in the Netherlands is also very much in the European context. So how should this all be arranged at a European level to have a certain degree of autonomy in terms of these critical inputs, and what kind of role could and should the Netherlands play in this sort of wider discussion within the EU? So I think that's one important discussion that is here, especially for the policymakers, but also for us policy advisors. More generally, I think the discussion is really about the supply chain resilience and the strategic autonomy kind of discussions. The thinking is really forming in terms of trying to identify dependencies. So in this sense, we are also very much thinking about the information availability for different products, different critical inputs. I think also how to coordinate this with partner countries. Second, I think this was also in Fernando's story in how can production capacity be built up here or in partner countries to ensure steady supplies of critical goods and critical products. So let me leave it there for now. I think that's the most important discussion here.
Yes, thank you. And I will briefly come back to agriculture also because it is relevant to what we're discussing for industry here. Georgis, there was lots of criticism of experiences, as I interpreted of stockpiling experiences in the agricultural sector. There was one question, I don't know whether you want to comment on it, whether there is any sound evidence what stockpiling actually did to food security. So I guess preventing famines and people falling below the poverty line. But perhaps then another question, also perhaps relevant to you. So the question where somebody said, well, we're criticizing that stockpiles and the prices at which they're being built can distort markets, but we don't know whether the market wasn't distorted before. So when we look at effectiveness, distortions, etc., we should also compare to other instruments. And we talked about AMICIS, so the transparency instruments that are there as well. So would you say there are some good experiences with agricultural stockpiles, and if so, what are the success factors? And how about the alternatives? So basically going for market transparency, working it out together, whether food is actually food supply.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sarah. It's always very interesting to have in a meeting Christian Haberli, because he really provokes a very nice discussion all the time. And Alan Matthews that Christian mentioned before. So what I have to say is that, and then Cosimo can complement on my words. And he highlighted that the situation is really, there's not one solution that fits everybody, right? I can see several examples here. I mean, Christian mentioned about Japan. Japan is a completely different country, and then he mentions also about the ASEAN, the regional stock holding program. These are completely different cases. Japan is a completely different country. They implement, as far as I know, they have an operational cost or buffer cost stock, which is very, very low. They have mostly emergency stock. So there are other stocks like the one that the EU had in the past, which was buffer stocks, basically to control prices, right? And this is why they had to give export subsidies to export the huge quantities that had been acquired. And Alan Matthews can correct me on that. So really, nobody can say that this is the right solution to do. It depends on the objectives. It depends very much on the status of the country. It is a different thing. We should examine differently a situation in a country that it is at a much lower level of development, that food security is the main objective of the government that they have to ensure this food security. So the conditions are not the same in each country. Of course, and this is what I saw somewhere, because the discussion in the chat is very, very interesting. I saw somewhere Isabella mentioning basically things that I wanted to say as well. She says that stocks are no silver bullet, but in assessing them, it would be productive to compare with the performance of alternative tools as well. You alluded into that, Nicola. So the thing is that when trying to assess whether having stocks or not is good or bad, we have to consider a lot of parameters. It is not one solution that fits all. In general, nevertheless, as Cosmo said in his presentation, public stockholding programs are extremely expensive. They have distorting, especially I'm talking about public stockholding programs for buffer stocks mostly. They are extremely expensive. They can distort the domestic market. They can create problems to the trading partners. So these are things that they have to be considered. However, and considering the impact on the food security and nutrition of a country, public stockholding, emergency public stockholding programs, for instance, they could be beneficial for the food security of the country in a period of a crisis. And I listened to what Dan said before. The Netherlands is a country that we produce what we need, right? So we don't need to stockpile. But there are countries that probably they would need to stockpile because they don't produce what they need. And and they depend on trade, which is very good. And we, as FAO, we advocate for that, for the transparent trading system. But sometimes emergency stocks, they can be useful. So what I'm trying to say in this situation is clearly that we cannot say yes or no to something. Of course, what we try to do with the study is to provide all the characteristics, all the elements there, so that countries and policymakers, they have all the information that they need to decide on the basis of the characteristics and the main elements of their own country. And I can hand it over to Cosmo if he wants to add anything, because he was disconnected for some point. That's why I took the floor first. And so please, Cosmo, if you have to say anything, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, George. No, what you were mentioning, certainly you cannot, as I was saying during the presentation, you cannot actually compare the different programs throughout the different countries. Because each country it has its own specific context. Even when it comes to the procurement, there might be countries, as I was saying, that are procuring basically domestically because they have also an objective of supporting the local farmers. But you have also to consider that there are countries that kind of do not have local farmers. Okay, so basically they are procuring by imports. So there are many, many, many different things that might be shaping the differences indeed among the different programs. Looking at the cost, for instance, now we are just talking about the procurement, the storage, and the release. But you have to consider as well that there might be countries that are implementing these measures throughout the value chain. Okay. There are some examples where the country is not only subsidizing, for instance, the import of food and the release of it, but they're also, for instance, subsidizing water or electricity for the specific factories that are processing those specific foods. So even the shape, the scope of the subsidy can be extremely different. Okay. On another note, you were mentioning before your paper of 2013 about value. Of course, I remember it. Actually, it was the first time, Christian, where I was reading about virtual stocks, which is also another interesting, I think, point of discussion that I don't think we will be able to discuss today. And I don't want to be long in what I'm saying. I see that Bettina already explained about the agreement on agriculture, the different annexes where you can find this kind of information on whether or not it is compliant with the WTO rules. I've seen as well somebody mention the ASEAN +3 emergency rice reserve, which is indeed a rice reserve which is normally used for emergencies. And a very important point on the stocks. Please consider the data that we have in FAO, so basically globally, are putting together private stocks and public stocks, because it's very hard at times to acquire information about the actual level of stocks in each country, because for each country, this is normally an issue of national security. So what we have are huge estimates that put together again private and public stocks. Okay, this is an important point to keep in mind for the overall discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And now I can come and work my way through a little bit the interesting questions that came from the audience. We already started. I think I have two for you, Stefan. One was about, and I'm not sure, maybe you answered already in the chat, but it was I found it interesting, this obligation for the private sector to hold some emergency reserves. The question was, this obligation, is this always WTO conform, or do you have sometimes discussions? What do you do to ensure conformity? Or do countries not worry that much because you're a rather small country? That would be interesting to hear. Yeah, perhaps I'll leave it there. I have more questions to you, but one by one.
Yeah, actually, we have sometimes WTO discussions because it's not so easy. Sometimes one department would like to adopt the import taxes to lower the import taxes together with the WTO. And on the other hand, we need the money to finance the compulsory stockpiling. So sometimes for certain positions, tax positions, we have problems, we have discussions also within the WTO. So it's a problem mainly for agricultural products, or only for agricultural products, actually.
And now that you mention agricultural products, and you said, well, it was interesting to hear that you said, oh, we're not even sure that we are stockpiling or monitoring the right products anymore. I think where you also have some energy oil products, I think, and pharmaceuticals. And Marion mentioned that Switzerland is very concerned about supply chain resilience. So from today's perspective, are you happy with your instrument? Would you say, well, maybe in some areas where we see these problems that the EU countries have described, some dependencies, etc., would you extend it to other products, or do you think there are other instruments that work better?
I think it depends. There are always pros and cons. I think the integration of compulsory stockpiles into the normal distribution channels is definitely a good thing. It means that the state does not have to know everything about purchase, storage, and sale of goods. It's also good that most stockpiles are financed by the industries themselves. That means that the companies involved have an interest in efficient and cost-effective compulsory stockpiling. Problems arise, particularly, we just mentioned it, when it comes to import taxes. Sometimes with free trade partners, there are some problems because it doesn't work perfectly all the time. And it's difficult sometimes with agricultural products where the lobby in Switzerland, but also, as I know, in other countries, is very strong and opposed to levying guarantee funds contributions on domestic production. That could be a problem, could solve the problem of import taxes. If, for example, we do not levy the contributions to import, but at the first selling on the domestic market. But when it comes to agricultural products, the lobby is strongly against it for the moment in Switzerland. So we could not change the law in these directions, so far at least.
Very interesting.
And, yeah.
There was something you wanted to add?
Yeah, one thing. I think our system is well suited to mass products, mineral oil or cereals. However, it depends. It's not always well suited when it comes to more specific products, like products used during a pandemic crisis, for example, because you cannot turn it over very easily in normal times. So the stock will be too high, and we cannot oblige the companies to hold stocks. They have to throw away after a certain times because the stocks are no good anymore.
Thank you. Perhaps, one question that came up, and I think I want to put that question to you, Bettina, but then also Fernando, because Spain is already teaming up with other countries. This question about managing stockpiles, perhaps virtual stockpiles, information together at a regional level. Is that a solution to some of the problems? Does it give more transparency? Does it avoid market distortions? What's the experience there? Perhaps more from the agricultural side.
Well,
Bettina?
Bettina?
Bettina, no, you don't want to take it?
Yeah, I want, but later. Bettina first, please.
No, I'm not so much in this question of virtual reserve, but what I would like maybe as well for the very, very final remark, I don't know, is what I find or what stresses me around the whole issue now of our debate is trade is hardly mentioned. So it seems to be that stocks are a bit debated, at least among ourselves now, as alternative. So my question is more on what role as a bid, Cosimo stated it's a bid within a huge puzzle, but what is with this issue of trade and import diversification? And I speak as well with the experience in the economic security debate, which is a bit on, let's say, sometimes, yeah, pursued a bit mercantilist again or protectionist. And so I wonder what is actually the best balance of having economic or food security via own production, domestic production and stocks and imports. Remember, the EU commissioner now has the double name of trade and economic security. So it's both in one person. So, but that stressed me a bit in the whole debate, how what is with the issue of trade and imports, knowing all the tensions, of course, but we should not forget there is trade as an option.
There's a possibility of trade. Yeah, it's good to remind us here, Bettina, and it's a great question also to put to you, Fernando. So you are going to take up this question of joint management, right? But perhaps you can even comment on that. So where do you see your system, strategic reserves, as opposed to, you also mentioned diversification, things like that, trade within the EU and with other partners?
Yes. Well, actually, we see a strong value in a joint coordination of strategic reserves and data systems at EU or OECD level, especially to manage cross-border risks, improve transparency, and particularly in avoiding duplication. While RECAPI is nationally based, its interoperability with European mechanisms is essential. For example, we have taken in our legislation, RECAPI legislation, all the dispositions on risk monitoring of the Critical Raw Material Acts, IMERA, the just announced 2 days ago, Critical Medicines draft that has just been announced. So all these dispositions, we have also absorbed them to be able to really be interoperable with European mechanisms. And we are not, and I insist, we are not proposing a centralized European stockpile, but rather a network of national capacities coordinated through common protocols and shared industrial intelligence. Of course, this approach could be reinforced to join EU or OECD platforms that focus on sharing data, as mentioned by Anne, or defining standards for new standards for public-private pre-contracting or new relationship, and especially in coordinated crisis response with clear rules that also offer mutual visibility. And yeah, well, that's all basically.
Well, that's a good answer. And I'll pick up another question, perhaps put it to you, Anna, because it's you also talked about, and Fernando just talked about a European system of stocks and exchange of information. And Tim Peter from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, he had a very important caveat, an interesting one, where he says, stocks of critical raw materials, at least in Japan, are treated as critical information and cannot be shared with the market. And that can be a problem. I think even with the AMASI system, sometimes it's a problem. So maybe not everybody wants to share how many stocks they have, in particular when it's individual companies. So is there a solution to that issue?
Well,
yeah. Sorry. Fernando, please.
You wanted to say something, Fernando?
I didn't know if it was focused to me, the question, so I have an answer, or it was focused to other person. Sorry if I just jump out like this.
Yeah, well, we'll let Anna comment, and then maybe you can add.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's a quite delicate question, and it's what concerns the companies a lot, in how far their data and intelligence is secured. That is why also in the Critical Raw Materials Act there is an explicit formulations also on the confidentiality of data, and that companies are also do not need to give data when they see their business secrets, for example, compromised. So it's always a delicate, sensitive data with regard also to competition. And so I would see the solution very much is there indeed, I think, in very small circles, unfortunately, and of course also on discussions in how far a very secure system of data sharing, intelligence sharing is being put up. I have a bit my doubts, let's say, if that is possible to do or in a good way, but that depends, I think, very much to do that kind of on a broader European level. First of all, I think it's important that the national governments kind of have a secure line of information sharing with their industry. In our case, it's also quite difficult because, as I said, we have a quite big, we don't have, like, for example, in Japan, what they do under economic security is that they have like a handful of big companies, and they are in very close discussions with a ministry there for economic security. They have a strategy. And so in our case, it would be difficult to imagine, and we had the same discussion in the gas crisis, which companies are system relevant or which sectors should be, and in who is kind of the most important one when there is no gas anymore. And so I think we will see that there are probably smaller circles, kind of, as I mentioned, for example, the sector of security and defense as one where there is kind of a way of finding ways to share in intelligence. But indeed, it's I think I think quite crucial to see how this can work. And we are at the moment very much in the discussion how this information sharing, knowledge sharing can be done between industry and the government. We have also, for example, in the critical raw materials sector, we have the Raw Materials Agency, which is a very, very good, let's say, agency, kind of very close to industry. And so we have forms of, in a way, sharing data without doing this very on a too sensitive level. But we are still very much in the discussions, I would say, how a good system can be developed and how a good exchange of information can be done. But just one remark so I wanted to do, which I think is also quite important when we speak about resilience and stockpiling, is in our view very much kind of how stockpiled metals or in general instruments for resilience are integrated in a more broader industrial strategy, because it makes no sense kind of to stockpile or to invest into certain domestic critical raw material extraction if we don't have the processing afterwards, if we don't have like the refining capacities. And so it all links together in a way kind of smartly also. And Fernando, you mentioned that also, which are the most kind of for the future industrial setting, which are the most important technologies, which are the most important sectors and products in the future, where we as Europeans also want to succeed, and want to invest in. And I think this also comes to and Bettina mentioned that when looking at this whole picture, where is trade, where is import, where is industrial policy, where is economic security, where is kind of, we speak about outbound, inbound investment screening. So all these instruments in a way need to be strategically combined together in order kind of to be successful. And I think this is, and stockpiling is one element of it in the discussion, but I think this is very important to put this together. Thank you.
Well, brilliant. Thank you, Anne. And we're already past our time, but I do want to ask Fernando whether you wanted to add or.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Well, basically, I just want to subscribe what Anne said and maybe just slightly complement that effectively sharing capacities for the companies is always sensible. So we have to have this into mind. But in the defense environment and in NATO, this is something that has been done for many years. So if there is classified protocols and procedures to avoid leakage, they are already in place. If not, they will be created. So what we have to do is to really change our mindset and thinking that security is not anymore, not only what NATO does in defense capacities, we should do the same in technology capacities or in raw material capacities, apply these confidential protocols and mindset to new sectors. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Perhaps one last word, Dan. Now that we've established that stockpiles are just a little piece in the big puzzle, and you said, well, often we're producing enough, but in terms, yeah, trade, information exchange, stockpiles, what role do the stockpiles have in the whole picture for you for supply chain resilience, let's say?
Yeah, so I think stockpiles can have an important, but maybe kind of a limited role in the whole story of supply chain resilience. But I think will require a lot of a lot of information. I think that's the most important thing. A lot of thinking and where necessary, I think the stockpiling can play an important role. And specifically, I think was very nice in Cosimo's presentation is to think about what is really the function of the different stockpiles. So for which raw materials, for different raw materials, you might have different objectives with your stockpiles. One can imagine that given in a changing geopolitical arena, some critical raw materials might be very difficult to obtain for an extended period of time. And I don't think you would want to have stockpiles for, to cover supply indefinitely. In this case, you would want stockpiles for some kind of transitory stage in which you figure out how to either find a different supply, or some kind of a substitution for some raw materials that will no longer be available. So I think for what is for me key is to think about specifically which raw materials are key, and for every single one of them, what are the reasons we would want or would not want to have stockpiles in these materials.
Well, very good. Well, I, for one, was able to pile up a lot of new thinking about stockpiles from many different areas and experiences. So I want to thank you for that, Cosimo, Georgios, for giving us the impulse, well, the experience from the agricultural sector, and then, of course, the group that can represent industry and agriculture, Stefan Menzi, Fernando Borreda Juste, Dan Freeman, and Anne Lauenroth, and our very active audience. And of course, last but not least, again, Bettina, for making this possible and for showing once more, well, turn to agriculture if you want to learn about what you're trying to do in other sectors. So in that sense, have a very nice afternoon, and thank you for contributing to the piling up of knowledge or insights.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.